Hey guys, my name's Taylor and today I'm going to teach you how to make this beautiful rustic entryway table for your house. Let's go. The first step is to find a good piece of wood. I was able to source a bunch of barnwood from a local farm that I'll use for a few different projects. I then went on to cut both ends off and measure what was left to work with. I made two 45-degree cuts from the middle of the board, which allowed for two leg pieces on either side and a top piece. Once the top piece was cut, I then made another 45-degree cut on each leg to reverse the direction of the angle. This will create a seamless waterfall effect when the table is put together. And then went over the boards and chipped off some of the loose bark that was on some of the pieces. Now comes the fun part. I sanded each board with my orbital sander to 80 grit, 150 grit, and then 240 grit to give it a smooth to the touch feel. Once the boards were sanded, I went ahead and used a wire brush to brush some of the loose material out of the places the sander couldn't get. The faces were a little rough from the miter saw, so I used a planer to smooth down the connecting faces and then did a test fit on my workbench to check the alignment. Once the alignment was up to par, I put some Titebond 3 wood glue on the connecting faces to let the glue absorb into the wood for a few minutes before I connect the joint with more wood glue. End grain glue joints are typically weak as the glue tends to get sucked into the wood. Applying 2 layers of wood glue a few minutes apart allows for a better bond. While the glue dries, I cut a 3/8 inch dowel into 4-inch pieces for the joint. I then tested the alignment one more time and marked the location of where I want the dowels to go. I am using the Rockler corner key jig for this joint. It's a 45-degree dowel jig that allows for super easy miter joints. Just line up your marking with the jig, clamp to the workpiece, and drill. Once the first dowel was locked into place, I cut off the remaining ends with a flush cut saw and then went on to finish the next 2 dowels for this joint. Once the dowels were in place, I used a few different pipe clamps to clamp everything together, making sure not to cover the dowels. You want to clamp this for a full 24 hours to ensure a proper bond. Once the 24 hours were up, I removed the pipe clamps and used a flush cut saw to saw off the ends of some of the dowels that had popped up as the joint came together. I then added a mixture of wood glue and sawdust to fill any of the gaps in the joint. After letting this dry for a couple more hours, I went ahead and sanded the end of the piece with 80, 150, and then 240 grit sandpaper. After the first side was done, I went ahead and repeated the same process on the other side of the workpiece. I was confident in my clamping abilities here, but I recommend you use an actual clamp with the rockler jig to ensure an accurate joint. I also tried to do things a little differently here by drilling the holes first and then gluing, but as you can see it's much more difficult to line up the joint. I ended up having to snap one of the dowels, drill it out, and redo it entirely. After the dowels were in place, I clamped everything together and let dry for another 24 hours. After 24 hours, I filled the gap with wood glue and sawdust and let dry for another 3 hours. I then used a flush cut saw to cut the dowels and then sand everything down on this side to 80, 150, and then 240 grit. I used a Varathane matte finish on this piece. If you haven't used it before, I definitely recommend you give it a try. It really gives a professional look to your project. Make sure to gently mix before use to avoid bubbles appearing in the finish. It's also best to use a high quality bristle brush as opposed to a foam brush or roller to create the best possible finish. After letting the first coat dry for a full 24 hours, I sanded it down with 320 grit sandpaper. It's best to do this part by hand to avoid sanding away too much of the finish you just applied. After I vacuumed down the piece one more time, I applied a second coat. then let this dry for another 24 hours. After fully dry, I then used 400 grit sandpaper to knock it down one more time before the final coat. I applied one more final coat and let dry for another 24 hours. Overall, I'm super happy how this piece turned out. The color is super rich and the texture is ultra smooth. It's not perfect, but neither am I, and that's what makes it one of a kind. If you like this project, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you again soon.